love for my people? Nah, just kidding, right? I'm just kidding. For me, if you were to cut open my heart, my chest and look at my heart, 49% of my heart is love for meat, and then 51% is my love for my people over here. All right, so you guys have now jumped meat in my heart. That should tell you a lot, right? But this is what we understand, right? When God gives us these people the way you're filled with love, all these things, it definitely motivates him to work hard, to continue to share the gospel, continue to set the tone for them, right? He wants to really love them the best he can, right? And really to love them the way Christ does. And so in this, he actually kind of says, not only do I want you to have love, but I want you to abound more and more in love. And so that's the first thing that we're going to focus on when he's talking about this, more and more and more. So one of the things that he says, you are all partakers with me, right? So when he talks about this, it's not just there are these people that are in church with them that are rooting him on, saying, hey, Paul, I hope you keep doing well. When he says these are partakers with me, these are people that are taking action with Paul. They're literally doing all they can to share the gospel or to share encouragement with them, right? Financial stuff, helping them, hiding them, doing all that stuff, right? Some of them might even be in prison with them. Some of them might get punished with him, right? These are all partakers with them. These are all people that are great at sharing love. Because we know Paul is great at sharing love, and he's literally saying, you guys are the same as me. We're all doing the same, and I appreciate you so much because we're all trying to do this, right? We're all trying to share love. So when he's saying you should abound more and more in love, he's telling it to a group that is great at loving well. He's telling them to do it even more. He's not just telling them to do a little bit. He's not just telling them to start, right? I was kind of thinking about this where it's like, there's no Christian quota of how much love we should share every day. I should say hi to this amount of people. I should encourage this amount of people. I should pray this, right? That's like the minimum. But he's like, no, it should be just nonstop as much as you can. The more you can share it, the better it's going to be, right? That's what we should be trying to seek, of just more and more and more love. And as he talks about this, he kind of compares it to Christ. And so we're going to see this more throughout Philippians. I don't want to go too much into Philippians today because obviously we have week by week analysis of each chapter, right? So I'm going to try to focus a little bit, set the tone for the rest, because this is still the introduction paragraph, right? This is his intro to his letter. So I don't want to jump into everything. But if you're going to see this theme of not only him, but every writer has this level of trying to love more. And obviously it comes from the example of Christ. And so in 2:4, you'll see this later. He talks about look not only to your own interest, but the interest of others. So Christ would be the ultimate example of how to love more and more and more, how to set that tone. And in that whole chapter 2, it basically talks about Jesus' humility to come down and serve us and love us in all these amazing ways. And the way Christ did this is really putting the interest of others above his own, right? Not just looking out for himself, but really to everybody. So that's kind of the tone that will set how we should love. And so one of the things I think is probably a good way to look at this of how can we love more and more, right? Most of you guys know the 5 love languages, right? Pastor Chang talked about this when we did Ephesians. But we talked about the 5 love languages, right? Words of affirmation, acts of service, gift giving, quality time, and physical touch. And so I think he asked everybody, what's their top one, right? What do you like to receive the most, or what do you like to give the most? And so for me, people ask me what mine is. I don't tell them because I'm like, it's all of them, right? Why would you settle for one? Why would you only want one as the top, and why would you want to give only one as the top? You should be trying to give more and more and more love. Right? If everybody has a certain one that they want, you should be able to give that level to meet them. Does that make sense? You should learn how to do all 5 love languages so that you can share more and more and more love. If you're good at acts of service, but you're not good at telling people compliments, things like that, you got to work on that, right? Because if somebody needs a compliment, somebody needs encouragement to love more and more and more, you need to learn that skill. Does that make sense? If you need to spend quality time, you need to learn how to make time for people. You need to learn how to start learning planning, scheduling, right? To be able to actually be there for people. Just because that's not your gift, but if somebody needs it, that's how you keep growing more and more and more. It's not a cutoff list. It's not just do one, right? Because when I look at this 5 love languages, I always tell people, technically when you look at God, he kind of mastered these and he did them all at every single level. He does them all the time for all of us. Words of affirmation, right? When you look at the scriptures, God's talking over and over again. He made us in his image. He made us with these gifts. He made us to be holy. He made us to be, for good works, right? God is constantly talking about with all these words of affirmation. When he talks about how he made them, what they can do, they're going to build empires, tear them down, all these things. Nothing can stop them, right? He just gives words over and over again. Acts of service. God is constantly doing things for us, right? Constantly drawing us in, constantly forgiving us, sharing grace, right? Never holds it back. Jesus is the ultimate level of acts of service. He literally came down to serve us, right? He says, I didn't come to be served, I came to serve. And he went all the way to the cross to serve us. Does that make sense? You want to talk about, does God master that love language? Absolutely. Gift giving. God says all the time, I'm always feeding you, clothing you, doing all these things. I'm a gracious God. I love to give gifts. Right? He talks about that. Gave them land, gave them all these things, gives people, the marriages, children, all that stuff, right? He's always giving gifts. Quality time. So many scriptures talk about God saying, always seek me. Look out for me, right? Come spend time with me. I told the youth on Friday, God is actually a very big party animal, right? And so if you know this, in the Old Testament, God had 7 parties a year. You guys know that? So they always had to have the Sabbath. They take the day off, every week off, right? But there was also 7 festivals that they're supposed to celebrate with God and be able to draw closer to him. Jesus, when we do the whole communion, right, the cup and wine, it was the Passover feast. It was a celebration of God freeing them from slavery. It was supposed to be a reminder that God always helps them be free. Jesus did it on that same day to be like, God, not only did God free you from physical slavery, now you're free from spiritual slavery. Let's celebrate this even more. Right? That's why we do communion even more than once a year. Does that make sense? It's meant to help us maintain that connection, help spend more time with God, connecting with him, seeking him. Does that make sense? But God always had these festivals for them to remember, celebrate. That's why they did Pentecost, right? All these things, the wind, God's Spirit filling people. He had 7 feasts. That's what they call them, the 7 feasts of Israel, right? To make them have more time with him. Not just the Sabbath, not just the traditional, one day off of time, right? But God is all about quality time. You see with his characters, come on the mountain, let me come see you, visit you, do all these things, right? God is all about that act of love. And physical touch. This one's a harder one to see how God is actually physically in our lives. But obviously Jesus will live this out a lot more. You see him touching people, hugging them, doing all these things, physically healing them. But that's where we kind of see, takes a little bit more effort to see how God actually physically touches our lives. But there's measurable ways that he does all these things. We looked at Psalm 34 a couple weeks ago for Fridays, where it says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Right? Most of us know that psalm where there's this teaching of God that's telling them, you can sense me, you can feel me. Right? There's a physical way to do it, and God tries to do that in many ways. We just don't always know how to do it, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you can see God does all these love languages, right? He's doing them all the time. He doesn't stop and say, I'm going to hit one only. And even if you have one that you like to receive the most, he still tries to hit you with all 5. Right? He's always trying to hit you with all 5. Even for myself, like I've read this scripture many times, right? I've always tried to grow in my love. And so for me, I'm pretty good at doing all 5. Right? I've tried to work all these different areas. Most people know I'm pretty good at like saying words of affirmation, right? Trying to compliment, trying to encourage people. Acts of service, right? I'm always doing a lot of things. Pretty good at gift giving. Spend a lot of quality time, right? You always make time to always be there for people. Physical touch. Some of you guys might be like, Joaquin's not a big on physical touch, right? Who thinks I'm big on physical touch? No. All right. So part of it is because of you guys that you don't know that I have physical touch. Because there's actually I heard some people joking around like, yeah, Joaquin's not a big hugger, right? And so I was like, who started this propaganda that I'm not a big hugger? It's like maybe there's a person that didn't want to hug me. They're like, I'm going to start this so now we don't have to hug them. When I started at this church, when I was doing the interviews, right, one of the things I shared that so there's challenges, right, to doing this job, certain things that I could see as potential hurdles. When we started, I started with COVID, right? Everybody was isolating, everybody was on Zoom. And so I was like, I'm a big hugger. I'm always hugging people, right? When I was in the Army, I always did the bro hugs, right? Every single day, morning and evening, right? And so even some of the Army people were like, how can you give bro hugs every single day? It's not like you guys are going off to war. You give those kind of emotions when you're leaving places, right? So I did it every day, and they're like, why do you do that? And I was like, tomorrow's not promised, right? The work we do, there's a lot of dangers in it. So it's like, we should celebrate every day we get with each other. And so every time I saw them in the morning, it's like, man, it's good to see you, right? And then even at night, same thing, right? Like, dude, what a great day we had together. Thanks for all the hard work, right? And so I'd always do this every single day. And it did help bring that mindset of every day's not promised, right? So my guys, and they appreciated it. Some of the women I work with, they didn't always want to hug everybody, so I had to come up with secret handshakes, right? And so but it was always to help them understand there's a way that we should connect and celebrate, right? But that's who I was. That's who I am. The first church I worked with is a black African American church. They hug all the time, right? It takes you 20 minutes to get from for Kevin sitting. If he wanted to leave right now, it would take him 20 minutes to get through because they'd be like, right? All the people would be hugging him. He'd be like, so it's such a festive group, right? But it's like I said, they hug all the time. So I did ministry there for a year and a half. I was hugging all these old ladies all the time, right? All these different things. So that's who I was. And so when COVID started, I'm like, okay, I get that everybody's kind of concerned, worried, right? They want to stay safe. It's like the kind of person I am is if somebody had COVID and needed a hug, I would still give them a hug. Right? That's how I viewed it. If they need a physical touch, I'm not worried about my life. I'm not worried about getting sick. I'll go give them that touch. But I know most of you guys would not want that, so I'm like, okay, I'll respect your boundaries. Does that make sense? But I was always like, I know how to put all the masks on. I know how to quarantine, or decontaminate, all that stuff, right? That's my exposure from the Army. Because even in the Army, there's times where guys get sick or they get exposed to stuff. We live in those worlds where there's a lot of things that they're trying to poison us with, right? Sometimes you got to save somebody or rescue them or you perform aid on them when you're not covered yet, right? And you need to save their life before you can put on your medical stuff. And we do it all the time. We do. That's what we live for each other like that. We love each other like that, right? So I've done that. I've been in those situations where it's like I'll risk my life just to make sure I can save them. And so that's where I was like, in this world, I was like, I would do the same thing, right? I just want to respect people's boundaries so I don't ever push it. But that's how I've always saw Christ do it, right? When we see Christ go to those people, all these lepers, all these people that are sick, nobody wants to touch them. They're so hurt by that, right? They're rejected all the time. And Jesus is like, come here. He hugs them first and then he heals them. It's the craziest thing, right? He doesn't heal them that way he can hug them, right? Because that's where it's like, oh, now you're better. He just literally hugs them first, like, okay, I got you, and then let me do this, right? So the way I've always saw it, and that's why I saw sharing that love, is like you should try to give it no matter what, without fear, right? Paul will talk about that later. He's like, I'm not even afraid of snake bites, all that stuff. But that's the way they viewed it. I need to share love. I need to share love no matter what. And so that's what I'm telling you. For myself, you could be like, hopefully that convinced you that I try to do all five, right? So I encourage you to do the same. Try to grow in all five. Do them all. Grow and do more and more and more love. And so this is where, obviously this is Paul's writing, but he takes it from Jesus, right? So 1 John in 3:16 through 18, it says, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and truth. And so for a lot of you, you'll know it's not easy to share love all the time. It's not easy to keep doing things for people, but this is where it's always written. How can you grow more to be able to sacrifice more to help somebody else? How to put them first. Does that make sense? Right? How can you keep growing? How can you build this love to where you're actually willing to lay down your life for your brothers and sisters? That's the ultimate level of love. Until we hit that point, that's where we're striving for. That's where we're trying to grow. And so this is where Paul kind of hits it, right? Grow in knowledge and discernment. These are the two words that he uses. And so it's important to understand because those two things can mean a lot of stuff, right? Knowledge is mostly we think about book learning, right? Certain things like that, and obviously discernment. But so I put a little bit of background definitions for you right out of this commentary. But basically the knowledge that he's talking about, it says the knowledge that Paul has in mind is not just intellectual, but experiential, acquired through acts of love. So when he says try to grow in your knowledge to be able to share more love. I was sharing with the youth on Friday where it was like, when I first did youth ministry, I used to be one of the hardest teachers. I was one of the meanest people you've ever met as far as a leader if you ever made a mistake, right? Most people never made mistakes because they were too afraid of it. Ever afraid for the punishment I would give on them, right? So when I first worked in youth ministry, obviously I can't punish them like I want to. And so the first group, I was always like, why do they not listen? Why do they not pay attention? Even like the first group I worked with, like they'd have like 6 good weeks where they're just constantly on fire for God. And then they would just hit that dip, right? Like, oh, I don't really care. They don't come. And they just go up and down, right? And so I'd be like, God, it would be frustrating as a leader, as a teacher. Because I'm used to the military, like they can't miss any training. They're like, I control their lives, right? They can't miss anything. And they don't move on until I say they can move on. And so I'm like, how come I got to see this, right? So I'm kind of praying to God, like, God, like, why are they, this is so difficult, right? Why did you give me people that are just up and down all the time? And so God's response was laughter. He's like laughing at me like, Joaquin, are you really the person that's mad about somebody going up and down? Right? He's like, you of all people, Joaquin, know how much you do that to me. Does that make sense? He's like, you constantly go up and down, and you constantly have seasons of passion, and then you just kind of go off. Right? He's like, I've been there for you. I've shared grace. I've shared love for you. Right? And so through that experience of trying to share and teach new people, I grew in my ability to love, right? Obviously to love God more and to follow him, but even to love the people I was teaching. I was like, oh, it's so natural to see this, right? Now you can understand there's more in their life going on, right? All these different things. So through the experience of trying to serve, I grew in my knowledge of how to love more, right? So this is where Paul is writing to that same group. These are people that are trying to love, love, love. And at the same time, there's ups and downs with it. They try to love, it works. Some people caught on fire. There's other times where they try to love and it got thrown back in their face, right? Or people question their motives or things like that. And so they needed to take that experience and keep growing and find different ways, different avenues to go hit them and be able to love them well. Does that make sense? I think there's a lot of parents in here, right? As you try to lead your kids, as you try to do all that, you've had to grow in love through experience, right? As you've had it, like, oh, they listen this way, they don't listen that way, or I need to motivate them this way or that way, right? Then you get multiple kids, then you got to motivate them differently. Does that make sense? Through that experience, through those hardships, you have to then love them more and more. You find new ways to grow in knowledge of how to love them. And most parents do it because they're full of love for them. Does that make sense? And it gets easier and easier, right? And so you enjoy that experience of growing in knowledge. And that's what Paul's really trying to tell them. You're trying to keep going, keep trying to share more and more and more love so that you get more and more experiences so that you can learn from them and get sharper and sharper and sharper. That you can somehow become more and more like Christ because you're facing the same opposition he did. You're facing the same people that he did. You're facing all these things, right? So you grow in your ability to love, but you also grow in your ability to know God's love for you because he kept facing that all with you and never gave up. He kept finding ways to share more and more love. And that's the reason why you're trying to share more and more love, because he broke through. And now you can go to Christ more and get more of his knowledge to be able to love more. And so the next, it says grow in knowledge and discernment. So the Greek term here used is aesthesis, and it refers to the ability to make decisions for the benefit of others. And so this is where it's important to understand, what is this knowledge that we're growing in? What is this love that we're growing in? Right? And so it's kind of like you're growing in your ability to love and love others. Right? So when you think about it, most of us know how to love ourselves very well. Right? If you're down, you know what food you want to eat, you know what dessert you want, you know where you want to travel, right? You know what you want to do for rest. Right? It's very easy to make those choices. Hey, let's go this way. Right? But if you're going out with a group of friends and you got to decide on a restaurant, everybody has different preferences. Right? All this, what's this? Oh, I need that. Right? Some people will be like, I've had a bad day, I want to go eat tofu. Right? It's like, right? Right? I'm sorry, I was just saying I like tofu in the morning and now I'm fighting it again. Those that have been in Arizona, my goal for this year was to be tofu free, have a tofu free 23. This church has not made that possible. But as we're talking about this, right, there's always these different preferences. And so when you're trying to figure out what is best for the group, right, sometimes you're like, let's just do it for this person. But if you do it for one person, you ignore the others, right? And so all of a sudden, some people feel left out, some people feel neglected. And in that, God's like, you need to grow in the ability to always factor in everybody. It's not easy to be a leader and factor in everybody's preferences. Would you guys all agree with that? Right? I know some leaders are right, like all day long, right? But that's what he's talking about. The more you serve people, the ability you'll have the ability to understand how much of a challenge it is to hit everybody's needs. And then that's why you seek God to get that discernment of how do I make a choice? How do I do what's best for everybody? And if somebody is left out, I'm going to trust you to handle it, God. That's how you want to do it. Because we're talking about, like, even when, for church, right, there's always a lot of serving to do, always a lot of stuff to do. And so there's, everybody tries to volunteer, right? Everybody at church has a lot of good hearts. And so sometimes you have to let some people do some jobs, and some people are like, okay, you can't do that. I need you to do this or do that, right? So sometimes you don't put people where they want to be, they don't want to serve no more, right? And they walk away, or they don't help at all, or they find another place to go serve, right? So as a leader, you're kind of stuck. You can't put too many people in one area because they just won't work, right? It won't be efficient. So you need that discernment. How do I put everybody in good places? How do I love them and help them serve the way they want to, right? And help them grow in that part. But I know that it's not possible for every person to have their number one option, right? So obviously leaders, we understand humility to serve everybody. But as we're training people, that humility doesn't match ours yet. Does that make sense? So we have to understand how to guide them, how to walk with them, how to be patient, right? How to put them in all the proper places because we're making decisions for all kinds of people, right? So as a family, you obviously have that same mindset, right? If you have multiple kids, you got to make choices that one kid, they want to go to their restaurant and the other one doesn't, right? Groups of friends, you guys have that as well, right? Like, well, we want to go here, we want to do this activity. Well, I don't like doing that. I don't like sports. I don't like this, right? So this is part of it. Like, how do you love it? How do you love people, right? So when you're really trying to love more and more and more, you're going to face all those obstacles because you're getting more and more people around you who then have even more and more preferences. Does that make sense? But there's always ways to discern, and God gives you that direction. The youth, they're hard to love, or I'm trying to figure out how to love them this year. So God gave me the wisdom. I was like, God, what can I do to get them to come on Fridays? And he's like, Texas Roadhouse dinner rolls. Right? So this Friday, we're gonna have. You can order just the bread by itself and that cinnamon honey butter, that is a gift from God. We're gonna have that, right? But that's where it's like, how do I satisfy everybody? So it even satisfies my one vegetarian that's back there, right? Like, I was like, how do I get a meal that can satisfy my biggest meat eaters and also the vegetarians? Is like, get those dinner rolls that butter. Butter unites everybody, right? But that's what we're talking about. It's something that it's funny to laugh about, but it's true. Like, if you've ever been in a leadership position, or if you've ever been a Christian trying to love people, you'll understand how much challenges there are. And this is why you need to grow in your ability to know, to have the knowledge and discernment to help, to be there for them. Does that make sense? And so this is where, I'm not just trying to tell you how to just grow, and I know how to, I got it all, right? The reason why I'm very successful in life and why I'm a good leader is because I've always followed this principle. God said, always keep growing. You're not done. Find more and more ways. And so I put that principle in my life, and it's always led me to good things. So even right now, I've been joking that I was the first Mexican at HOC3, and then now I'm the only Mexican in all of HOCs, right? And so I was trying to make some connections with some other people that are doing Asian ministry, right? So I ended up meeting this lady that she's a Chinese pastor. She's Chinese American. She was from Long Island. She went to Harvard. Volleyball player. She was trying to teach me how to play volleyball so I could beat some people. But she's going to be a senior pastor in the peninsula, right? So her and her husband, they actually try to connect all these people in the Asian ministries, right, throughout the Bay Area. So they try to create support groups, things like that. And so this lady heard about me through a mutual friend. Like, there's this Mexican guy working at a Chinese church. So it's like, I got to meet this guy. And so when I met with her for boba last week, she was saying, like, you're a unicorn. And I was like, what? And so she's like, all the churches that I'm connected to in the Bay Area, all these Chinese, all these Asian churches, right? She's like, there is not one Mexican person working at any of them. And there's not one Mexican that's ever volunteered to work at a Asian church, right? So she's like, why? So she had all these questions of me. Why am I doing this, right? And so obviously I had my answers, but it was just kind of funny to hear that, right? But so she was like, what are you looking for? I was like, I'm looking for people that I can, that are doing this ministry, similar people groups, similar backgrounds, right? That can help me get sharper at doing this job. That can help me shepherd my people better, to help me love more and more the way they need to be loved, right? And so that's where she was like, okay, like, that's really great, right? Because they have all the experience. They've done it for 10, 20, 30 years, right? They know what the same cultural backgrounds. They know what parents think, right? They know all that stuff. What do I need to avoid? What areas I need to push or not push? Does that make sense? I know how to lead, but I don't know how to lead every single part of your guys' lives. So how can I love you more? By continuing to grow and grow and grow. Does that make sense? And so I have a meeting next week with the pastor. They said, you know him, his name's like Brian Hui. But basically he was here, got married here, right? So he's a senior pastor in Union City. But that's what they can do. They have experience with HOC3, right? So they can help me. It's like, hey, how do I maintain hope in this? How patient should I be, right? All these type of things, right? How can I grow as a minister in this calling that God put me in? Does that make sense? So I'll like over the next 2 months, there's like 20 people I'll be meeting with that experience to help me grow and give me areas that I could try to see how can God keep shaping me. Does that make sense? But if I love you guys and say, man, I can't just settle on what I do right now, right? Everything I'm doing is good, yes, but I want to do it more and more and more. That's how Paul was writing it, but that's ultimately what Jesus wanted, right? I want you to be more free. I want you to have more hope. I want you to have more faith. I want you to have more love. And so in order to do that, we got to grow. We got to commit ourselves to grow. So you're not the only one that I'm telling you to grow. I'm committed to that same process, right? Growth. And so Paul will end this, right, when he talks about why it's important to grow. And he uses the phrase, fruit of righteousness. It says that you be filled with the fruit of righteousness. So obviously this terminology, fruit, right, we know it pretty well. We understand that it's a process that takes time. Every time they use fruit is meant to show you this growth, right? You prepare the seed. You plant it, you water it, you let the roots grow down, right? Eventually then it starts growing up, then you grow out, and then it starts growing fruit. You prune it, do all that stuff, right? Even when you get the first fruit, it's not that good. You have to keep pruning the tree, right, to get better and better, sweeter tree. Does that make sense? You guys know that there's a festival of the first fruits? That's part of what, like, when they got the first fruits, they're supposed to give it back to God, celebrate, right? So that's why that's why I said, God's always, when they get their first fruit, he's like, let me taste that bad boy, right? Let me taste that. Let me see what you produced. All right, but that's why I said God always had this communion and touch with them. But when we're talking about this fruit, right, that's where it's this principle of there's this growth process, right? And so, and even righteousness, that's a tricky word, right? Because we hear that word all the time. So when we look through the whole book of Philippians, there's going to be two concepts that Paul talks about. The righteousness of Christ and the righteousness of God. And so it's important to understand that there's going to be two very significant elements to that. So like I said, we're not going to cover everything today because the point is that's what we'll go through the whole book chapter. But this is where they call it Pauline theology, where there's certain views that he's trying to establish. So when he talks about this word, we got to know what he's talking about. It's not just the same righteousness that's throughout the Bible. And so this phrase from the commentary says, this phrase, filled with the fruit of righteousness, is at the end of a long sentence that begins with Paul's prayer that your love may abound more and more. Paul looks forward to the day of Christ when his prayer will be completely answered. Paul prays on that day when Christ examines the fruit produced in his vineyard, the church. He will find fruit of pure motives to love and blameless service of love. That kind of fruit is the fruit of righteousness. In this context, righteousness describes the character and actions of a community totally permeated and controlled by love. Since love is a relational word, this use of righteousness points to relational righteousness, right relations with one another. So that's where, like, it's kind of cool when you see the grammar, right? When you first read it, did you notice it was one big sentence? No, right? Because somebody's handwriting is not very good. You can't tell the commas and periods. But even when I read in the Bible, I had to look back. It was like, was it really one sentence? And it's like, wow, it's one sentence. One sentence. His prayer starts with abounding more and more in love, and that's what will give them more fruits of righteousness. Does that make sense? That's his whole train of thought right there. The more you love, the more fruit you will see. And so that's what we're trying to understand what he's trying to push to them. You should have a community that's so full of love that is full of all kinds of fruit. I love the way this author put it, right? He's like, the community is totally permeated and controlled by love. Can you imagine that kind of community where it's just totally permeated with love? Everywhere you look, you can't escape love. Every corner you turn, there's somebody that's ready to give you some love. Right? Isn't that pretty cool? If everybody was controlled by love, nobody ever took action in hate, envy, jealousy, things like that. They just always acted in love. That'd be a great community. Right? I was going to ask the question later, be like, what percentage do you think our church is permeated? How much love are we? I was like, maybe that's not a good question to ask in group. But for the most part, right, I'm sure none of you think 100%. Does anybody think this church is totally 100% permeated in love? Is there anybody at least over 50%? The church has 50%. All right, at least need one. Thank you. Or I don't know if you're scratching your face or raising a hand. All right, but does that make right? So Paul is talking about a community that's totally permeated in love. 1 second. I tell you that worship, man. You guys keep getting me singing all the. Yep. All right, but this is what he's talking about, right? Imagine that's what we should be our end goal. If we're trying to do more and more and more and grow and grow and grow, the end result should be a totally permeated community of love. A group that's always trying to love all the time. And so as we see this part, that's our end goal, but this is obviously not only what Paul has written. This is what all the writers kind of write about, right? Love is a very big theme throughout the New Testament. So like I said, we're not going to finish Philippians. I don't want to hit every single one that Philippians talks about it, but I want to show you these other authors, right? In 1 Peter, it says, in 1:22-23, it says, having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart. Since you have been born again, not of a perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of God. Here we see the same concept, right? Being able to have brotherly love from a pure heart, and it's from a seed that's going to be grown, right? Peter will say later, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. Right? Here it is again, love, love, love. We did the same terminology in Ephesians, right? We were made as God's masterpieces, made for good works that we were prepared beforehand to always do, right? We were always called to do this, to be loving, all that. And so you see all these authors are in agreement. They're all talking about this, where it's like the way you love really testifies to the community that you're building and really testifies to who you're a part of. Are you a part of Jesus? If you are, you're going to be loving, loving, loving. So here, obviously, the 1 John's on the bottom. I could not fit the whole 7 through 21, because my handwriting, I couldn't get it small enough. So I encourage you to look it up later, but I put the highlight of this section, basically in 16 through 19, right? It says, so we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because he is also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. And so this, when I mentioned earlier, right, there's a physical touch that God gives us. There's a way we can actually sense him and have him in our lives. This verse is where I see that laid out for us. It says, God, in the middle, it said, God is love. Whoever abides in love abides in God. And then the end of it says, and God abides in him. If you are actively trying to love, you are having God inside of you. He's literally inside of you, giving you that ability to do all those things. When you read the Old Testament, there's a lot of mentioning of God's hand on them, God inside them, right? There's all these things where it's like they were able to sense God and have that physical connection with him. Does that make sense? When you read like Samson, something that says the hand of God was on him, then he was able to have the strength to do all this. They had this thought, they had this idea of like when they're doing what God made them to do, God was with them 100%. They could feel him. They could sense it and just have the confidence to go fight and do what he said to do. Does that make sense? There was something that was measurable that they could now see that they were not the same. They had his hand on them and they could go do what he asked them to do. Right? So a lot of Christians debate that where it's like, because it always says God was in them, the Spirit was in them, Spirit in them. And we're like, wait a minute, the Spirit doesn't come into you till the Holy Spirit. Right? And so that's why I said there's a lot of thought behind this. But there's this, can you have God's inside of you? Can you sense him and do what he's asking you to do? And so John is kind of sharing that, where it's like when you try to share love, you will have God inside you. You're literally doing what he's made you to do. You're literally connected and able to actually give out love based on him being inside you. Right? When you know Jesus, there's actually a teaching where they ask him, Jesus, how can we see you? How can we touch you? And he says, if you want to see me, I'll be with all the orphans, all the people that are broken-hearted, that need healing. I'll be with all of them. When you see me doing all that, when I'm doing all that and you're there, you'll see me. He's literally telling them, I'm out there sharing love, so if you're out there with me trying to share love, you'll be able to see me. Right? They're giving this, like there's a physical thing that we can experience with God. And this is one of the clues. As you try to share love, you will be far more connected than you ever realize. You will really then have God inside. You will really sense him inside you. God, the Spirit is inside of us. But for most of you, you'll probably agree, I don't always sense it all the time. I don't always feel it, or I don't know if, a lot of people always question, is the Holy Spirit inside me? Right? But that's where we say, like, as you're trying to share it, as you're trying to overcome all these hurdles, overcome all these different ways, love in ways you've never done before, you will see God did it through you. God gave you those abilities. He grew those ways, right? He's connected with you. You'll sense him so much more. As a part of why, when Paul's saying abound more and more in love, most of us always hear that and we're kind of like, what's the benefit? Or why do I need to do this? If you've ever really tried to love a lot, you'll understand the difference of the life you get to live. That makes sense? When you're trying to really love people and love them the way Christ does, you think your life's going to be sad and like all kinds of dreary? Or you think it's going to be pretty joy-filled and you're going to be surrounded by people that are trying to do the same? Does that make sense? You're literally, that's why Paul's saying, I'm trying to share love and now I have all these partakers with me. I'm not alone. I have all these people encouraging me. So much of it. That's why when you read Philippians, so much mentioning of joy through all the trials, joy through all the imprisonments, right? Because why? He's sharing love, so much love that God's inside him so much that he's so connected to God. It's such a relief. It's such a benefit, right? So for all of you, it's like, why do I need to do this? Or I think I love enough. It's like, if you've ever felt God, if you know God's giving you love and how much there's still more that he can give, you're like, I have an appetite for that will never be satisfied. Right? I want more and more love. And not only do I want it, but I want the people that I'm around to have it as well. Right? That's where you're like, I not only want to be able to feel it, but I want to go give it, share it, do all these things. Because even so, as we're talking about this, right, it takes time. Sometimes you'll be like, I'm not loving enough, or I wish I loved more quicker, things like that. Right? The growth process, it does take however long it takes. right? But this is where it's important to understand God's the one that's growing it, and he's going to give you the answers to your prayer. I shared here that I'm pretty good at words of affirmation, right? I'm pretty good at complimenting people. But if you know who I am, I was never like that all the time, right? So especially in the Army, I did not compliment people all the time. I grunted at them, give them good pats on the backs, right? But we're not sitting around telling them like, oh, I love you, or you're so cool. That's not how we work. Does that make sense? And so when I first started ministry, I was always like, man, I'm at a disadvantage because I don't share a lot of compliments. I don't do all this stuff, right? The only time I'd ever compliment my people or give them gifts was when I was getting ready to leave, right? Every 2 or 3 years, I would be reassigned. I'm like, oh, I'm going to share all the things that I saw, right? And encourage them to lead after I'm gone. So that's the only time you would ever hear me say something. They're like, wow, like I wish I would have heard this for the earlier, right? But that's how God made me at the time. And so as I was doing ministry, I obviously was very reserved with my feelings inside. And so one of the hardest things I think was for me was to actually pray for people, right? So sometimes you're like, can I go up to somebody like, hey, can I pray for you? Can I, what's going on? All this other stuff, right? We just don't do that. We don't share any feelings in the Army, number one. So that was a whole nother thing, right? Now I got to actually ask people to share their feelings for me to pray about it. And so as I was doing ministry, working with all these different groups, I always felt like, man, I'm not really hitting that prayer life. I'm not really hitting prayer for them that much, right? And I see Paul right here, he starts with I'm praying for you. I'm praying that you abound in this and abound in that, grow in this, right? So I've always seen these characters of God, his heroes, that have this big heart that they're constantly trying to pray for their people, right? Be that connected to them. And so I would do all these ministries, do all these different events. And so people, I could see they needed somebody to pray for them. I'd just wait till somebody else did it, right? So, but I'd always be working with my mentors and leaders. I want to, but there's this fear inside of me that holds me back. And so when we did the All HOC retreat, the Saturday night back in July, the speaker was Dr. Gary Kwong, right? That's his last name? Kwong, yeah. So he shared that perfect love drives out fear. He used a similar verse. And so he was sharing in your heart, there's all this love that you want to share, but there's these fears in your mind. So basically those two collide, and then all of a sudden it can't flow out, right? So he's once you get rid of those fears, all the love can flow out. And so when we were doing this retreat, at the very end, he was like, can all the pastors come up stage so everybody can come up for prayer, right? And so as he does this, in my mind, I already know none of the youth are going to come up, right? I've done a lot of youth. That's where I've done a lot of these conferences, retreats, and all these different youth groups, and nobody ever comes up on stage, right? It's a lot of pressure and all these different things, right? A lot of judgment. And so I'm always safe because when he does that, I'm I'm safe. I don't have to pray for him. I just got to wait for the time. I can check out my box. I'm efficient. I was there. I was obedient, right? So I was I can just stand here and not have to worry and not go out of my comfort zone. Right? And so, but for years, I've always been I want to pray, I want to do it, right? And so when Gary's words were talking about it, once you have the right kind of love, the fears go away, right? So for this last year, I was saying we got really close. We've been sharing a lot, right? A lot of encouragement, a lot of compliments, just really sharing our struggles, right? So I felt the group itself has shown that there's no reason to fear, right? So I was instead of just stepping back or just waiting, I actually went to all of them and asked them if I could pray. Right? So it just seems every pastor does that. Maybe, but that's not what I've ever done. Does that make sense? I didn't grow up in church. I've never. That's why prayer life is very different because I was on my own with my faith. Right? So how to relate to community, how to do all the other stuff. All I know is in group time, you're everybody have a prayer request, right? That's the easiest. It's part of the system. It's not me asking. But for me to ask somebody, be hey, can I pray for you? Can you share something with me? Right? The fear was man, I don't trust you enough, or I don't know if I want you to know that. Right? There's all these fears that go through your head. But that's where I was I didn't feel that with our group, right? And so that's where I saw hey, I was okay, God, you're giving me the motivation to move forward, right? You're giving me the courage to at least step forward. I don't know what's going to happen, what they're going to say, right? So obviously the first group was some of the middle schoolers that just jumped up to the high school. So I didn't know them that well. I was they're so close to Camille, right? So I'm sure if Camille asked them to pray, they would say yes. So I was I don't know what they're going to say to me. Right, so I was but I'm going to try, right? And so I was I want to try to grow in this love, try to grow in this ability to do this that I see that they're saying, right, to pray for their people. So I asked them, they let me pray, right? And they're yeah, okay. So I prayed for them. Everybody else let me pray, right? And so it was such a great experience where it's man, it was so cool to hear what was on their mind, right? Just hear it and just be able to pray with them, to take it to God. Does that make sense? And so that after that experience, I was some of you guys know I stayed up 65 hours out of the 72 hours of the retreat. Right, and the only reason why, but it was having so much fun and enjoying all the love that everybody was sharing there. The only reason why I slept is because I had to make sure they slept, because their parents would be mad if they stayed up all 72 hours like I was gonna do. I wanted to do. Does that make sense? I wasn't even tired. I was man, I want to keep hanging out, keep wanting to know more and more. Right, but that's where we see this reward of growing in your love. right? I could have been stuck in my fear. I could have been stuck in my comfort zone and said, I don't want to try this. I don't want to try that. Or I don't know how they're going to respond, right? But God's like, you kept asking me to grow more and more. You keep asking me to help you with this fear, right? So that's why I said, there's a lot of things I'm not afraid of. Yeah, of course. Or I've learned how to conquer it. But there's areas that, like I said, it's just, I always tell people, soldiers have the weirdest fears. Because some people are like, you guys literally run at bullets and bombs. It's like, yeah, but we have some of the strangest fears to counterbalance, right? But that's why I say, like, to ask somebody to be vulnerable, I was like, we would never do that. Does that make sense? We just fight through it. And so never having an experience, that's where God's like, do you want this ability to love more and more, right? And so that's where I said, like, you had to trust God to push. He got rid of that fear. And because of that, now it's like I learned a lot of what they were going through, and it helped me then shape even more stuff for the future of what we could talk about. Does that make sense? Like how they sense, like, are they close to God or not? So now, because he helped me do that, now we can hit even more and more. I can share more and more love because God helped me get through that growth, right? Face that tough spot. And so that's where it's at. It just makes the job more rewarding. It makes my life more rewarding to keep pushing in that way. And that's my encouragement to you all. These guys are all writing about the benefit of having love, God's love in your life, but even pursuing more and more and more. Right? You can cap off what you want God to do in your life. You can say, I only want you to touch this area, that area. I only want to get it in this way, or I want to give it in that way. And you're limiting what you can truly experience. And God is saying, like, I am love. I am every aspect of it. I am love in every possible way. Do you want to have that for you? And do you want to be able to share that with everybody around you? If you do, if you want that kind of life, let me show you how. And that's where Paul's like, he pursued that, and he shows you the process of how joyful it can be trying to do that, even through some of the toughest situations. Does that make sense? And so that's why I said, like, all I can leave you with is that encouragement to really have a desire to be able to love more and more and more. If you have that true desire to love more and more and more, then you will then start taking it to prayer. God, what areas do I need to grow? What ways can I do it? What ways can I find, how can I try to do it? Or I tried it before, it didn't work. How can we learn from that? Right? So I ended with the applications for you. Read the full section of 1 John 4, 7-21 tonight before bed. Pray to God for the ability to feel his love more, be filled with more of his love, and the strength to love the people he has put in your life. Number 2, rate yourself from 1 to 10 on your ability to share love. Reflect on how you can improve little by little, right? It's not about getting everything right away. Step 3, hang around people that love well and try to learn more new ways to love. Take those skills to your regular circle of people to love them with new ways. So that's why I say, like, the whole love language, right? All of you have good ways to do it. But there's plenty of people at this church that have all these strengths and ways they can love, right? Hang out with them, surround yourself with them, see how they do it. If you're not a good gift giver, right? You're like, I never have any ideas. Hang out with somebody that's very observant, right? Look at how they pay attention. Elaine does a great job at getting snacks, desserts, all this other stuff, right? We were talking at the rehearsal dinner where they were like, oh, there's these desserts, like a new restaurant called Pineapple King that's supposed to be coming, right? And so it was like, she already knew about it. She's like, I'm keeping track of the location opening date so that I can share it with all you guys. Does that make sense, right? I was like, there we go, because she's brought like all these different desserts after church, right? The mochis and the cookies for people's birthdays, the wedding proposal, right? She got all this connection to desserts, but she's not done yet. She's like, once this bakery opens, I'll be first in line to get you guys some of these. Does that make sense? So that's why I said, like, there's people that have different gifts. Understand how they're looking. Ask them, how do you keep track of all this stuff? How do you look for it? Does that make sense? And trust me, they'll share it, and at the same time, you can then find ways to do it yourself. Does that make sense? But God gives us all these people that know how to love in all these variety of ways. He's not saying just let them love that way. He's saying all of you should share your knowledge and love all across the board, right? So lean on this group. Then the next one, take the results to God for the positive and negatives that come from these experiences. Share your heart so he can get closer to you and show you how to turn all these experiences into more growth to love. All of us pray to be closer to God, right? All of us wish we could sense him more, hear from him more, all these different things. God is literally telling you he's trying to love all the time. And the best way to know him and the best way to get close to him is to try to do the same. He gives you that invitation. Try to love, and trust me, you'll come to me more and more and more, because it ain't easy. Because even we know, sometimes we don't always want God's love the way he gives it, or sometimes we want it on our time, right? We're always struggling with it. And so God knows how hard it is to try to love people and love them well. So it will literally make you closer and closer because you're sharing that experience. Same way Paul said, we're partakers of the gospel, right? We're drawn together because we're sharing the same work. You can get closer to God by literally trying to share the same work. And so, because it will be positive and negative. And at the end of the day, the last one, thank God at the end of every day for the love you received and the ability to share the love that day. Pray to receive more love the next day and to share a little bit more as well. Paul kind of started with prayer for them, and he obviously ends it with prayer for them, nonstop. And this is where God's kind of saying, right? Have that thankful, because he'll talk about thankfulness too in Philippians, where it's like, as you have that thankful attitude for the love you received and the ability you were to share for that day, you can then just pray for more and more, right? That contentment that comes from it, but also the desire to do more, have more and more. And God's like, you should be greedy for love, right? Like he never says, I can't believe you want more love or you want to share more. He doesn't do that, right? So hopefully you have this desire and you can take it to God and really seek out the love that he wants you to have for your life. So please join me as we close in prayer.